Hi everyone, this is BritSimon. So we need to talk about the DV2021 scheduling of interviews. Today is December 1st. The process for scheduling of interviews and sending out the 2NLs would normally mean that 2NLs for January interviews had to have been sent out by close of business yesterday, the end of November. And that's a regular cadence, a regular sort of way of operating, that there are 2 calendar months difference between the 2NL, the notification of an interview date, and the interview actually happening. So that during that period of time, and it roughly means about 6 weeks or so, you have around about 6 or 7 weeks from when you get the email to the earliest date which you could be interviewed. That's roughly the timeline. Some people have a little bit more or a little bit less time, but that timeline is normally pretty important, because in that timeline you have to gather your final paperwork, but you also have to arrange your medical and just make arrangements to be at the interview. Okay, so it's not normal that they would send out a 2NL, let's say, during December for January interviews, or that they would send out 2NLs in January for February interviews. Normally, it wouldn't be from 1 month to the next, it would be a 2-month gap or a 2 calendar month gap. So, at least 6 or 7 weeks. So that's the normal process, and that hasn't happened. So we now know, and people have been asking me, will there be interviews scheduled in January? And I have consistently said over the last couple of months, we have to wait until the end of November to know for sure what KCC are going to do. I didn't want to take anybody's word for it. I didn't want to speak to someone at KCC and ask them. I wanted to see what they were going to do. I wanted to see if they were going to schedule interviews. Now we know they haven't scheduled interviews in January. The reason for that is I can only assume that they are not scheduling interviews because of the immigrant ban. It's almost as if, and I messaged Charles Cook this morning about this, it's really quite an amazing situation, because it's as if they have decided that they presume to know that Trump is going to extend the ban, and that there would be therefore an immigrant ban in January. There isn't currently that plan. Trump hasn't talked about extending the ban. He could do, but he hasn't at this point talked about extending the ban. So they're not scheduling interviews, even though they really could be in many of the embassies around the world. There are some embassies where, according to past procedures, prior to the DV2020 lawsuits that we had, where they would not schedule interviews in, let's say, the Schengen area, or some other countries which are affected by the 14-day bans. But the immigrant ban, which is Proclamation 10014, that should be gone by December 31st, right? As far as we all know at the moment. Trump may be thinking something else, but as far as we all know, that is due to expire on December 31st. So it means that KCC are taking the position that even while the immigrant ban is in effect, that they are not going to schedule interviews. That's, I'm quite surprised in a way that they've chosen to operate that way. And it either means that they have decided they can't schedule interviews while the immigrant ban is on, or they're assuming that the immigrant ban will be extended. It's one of those 2 positions. I don't know which. But either way, frankly, it's not appropriate. It's the Judge Mehta in the previous lawsuit instructed the government to operate in a quite different way, and pointed out that sort of behaviour, the behaviour that KCC and the government are operating on right now, is not legal behaviour. Okay, so and he was quite clear that there's no justification in the law for what they're doing. So we have had a federal judge, in fact 2 federal judges have taken that same position. and KCC continue to operate that way. What will happen now? Okay, so we need to talk about what will happen. Well, the first thing is that if we don't do anything at all, if there's no sort of legal process that goes on behind the scenes, then it seems to be that KCC won't schedule interviews for January, and then there's no difference between the 2NLs we were expecting in November and sending 2NLs in December, which means that we should, if they continue this way, we should lose December 2NLs as well, which is February interviews, right? So we would lose February interviews, and then we would get into January. Now, January may come, and we may not have the immigrant ban extended. But if it is extended, then we would lose January as well. And remember, President-elect Biden only becomes President Biden on January the 20th. Okay, so we'll lose all of January for scheduling as well. So we'll effectively lose January interviews, February interviews, and March interviews. And we've already lost October, November, and December interviews. So we will, at that point, have lost 6 months of interviews. Now, in that scenario, there is not time to process all of the cases. There just isn't enough time. We already know that there are some limitations around the world where some embassies are closed because of COVID. We already know that there's limitations on processing ability, even at KCC, probably due to COVID, and precautions or actual sickness that they're having, perhaps at KCC, we don't know. And there'll be other agencies, by the way, that also will be impacted by these things. And so, we have to sort of come to terms with, okay, the way they're operating now is going to cost us 6 months of processing, and that's pretty damaging. I've said before, losing the first 3 months of processing, to be honest, wasn't a big deal, because with 9 months, there was enough time to process all of the cases. But and the first 3 months actually are very quiet time anyway, because you've got every year, October, November, December tend to be the 3 quietest months of interviews, and we don't see a lot of activity in those months. But if we lose January and February and March, that would be a much bigger impact. And as I say, I think that would be pretty obvious at that point that there isn't enough time in the remaining 6 months to process all of the cases that we need. So that's going to be impactful. How would that impact us? Well, I'll talk about how that would impact us in a few minutes, but let's talk about what else might happen before we go on to that. So Charles Cook and his colleagues, Jeff Joseph and Siskind, man, I'm bad with names these days. So you've got the 3 lawyers, Cook, Siskind, and Joseph, and they have already started a lawsuit to try and fight for DV2021. Their lawsuit includes some other groups, some other affected parties as well. But they are going for a TRO, a temporary restraining order, and with the case law that they've now established by fighting the DV2020 suit and having Judge Mehta's very clear statements about how how the government and KCC need to operate, they can take that information and they can fight for some sort of immediate injunction or temporary restraining order upon the government to say, stop misbehaving, stop acting illegally and not scheduling interviews because of the immigrant ban. Remember, the DV2020 lawsuit essentially resulted in a statement from Judge Mehta saying that just because you can ban entry, and the president has the power, according to Judge Mehta, to stop entry into the USA of immigrants, just because you can stop entry does not mean you should be stopping issuance or processing of those cases. And that's essentially how we were able to get some processing done in the final weeks of September. and it's the basis upon which we're hoping to get more visas released for DV 2020. But so they're doing the very same thing now. They're saying, well, immigrants are banned, so we're not going to process them. They're actually saying, they seem to be saying at least, immigrants will be banned in January, so we're not going to bother even interviewing them in January either. And that's frankly unacceptable. I have no doubt at all that that Charles Cook and team will be fighting vigorously and will hopefully, fingers crossed, achieve an injunction or a TRO, temporary restraining order, and have another federal judge say the same things that that were said before, that the government have to process cases and shouldn't cost us this time. Obviously, it's not certain. I can't predict for 100% certainty what the outcome will be, but those arguments have already been won in a previous lawsuit, and so I wouldn't be at all surprised if we can win those arguments again. Right? It makes perfect sense. And in fact, each time an argument is made in a court of law, it becomes precedent or important for subsequent cases, and subsequent cases can rely on that earlier wording and that earlier decision of a federal judge. So that lawsuit is going to go ahead. Now, the timing of that lawsuit will probably mean a decision, I'm hoping, in sometime in December, but it could easily sort of drift, bearing in mind December is the Christmas period, it could easily drift into January. But even January, I mean, although that would be late, that would be better than nothing, because perhaps we could get interviews scheduled in January on an emergency basis, let's say for February, or perhaps even for later in January. And again, if we can get the TRO in December, perhaps we can get emergency basis and we can get some January dates back and get some January interviews done. I don't know. I'm purely speculating. You must understand this is speculation. Please don't think that we can be certain of winning or we can be certain of the outcome. But those are the sort of the best case scenarios that I could imagine, that we would win a TRO and that the judge would say you have to start processing immediately, and that further he would say you have to prioritize these cases and give them immediate interviews and cut down that 6 or 7 week period of time where people arrange their medicals and that sort of thing. It's not the right way to process DV cases. And it will create some stress and some problems if we get into that emergency scenario. But so be it, if that means that we can get some January interviews and some February interviews, and that we can get a few thousand cases processed at the beginning of the year. That would be the best possible outcome at this point. So what else would that mean for the rest of the year then? Let's talk about that. Okay, so let's talk about the rest of the year, knowing what we know now, or what I've just discussed about the lawsuits, etc., and the scheduling. So let's talk about the monthly process, or the monthly number of visas that we could issue, and try and calculate how bad the impact would be, both in the scenario of we've only got 6 months to process, or we've got more than that because Charles Cook and co are able to buy us some time, right? So I know that some of you will be thinking, well, in September of 2020, they processed 6,000 visas in 3 weeks. That's true. But that does not mean that they could do 8,000, let's say, in a complete month. Because, largely speaking, the 6,000 we got processed in the end of September were cases that were already sent to the embassies in March and April, May time, actually for interviews that were cancelled in March, April and May. So in that scenario, KCC handled a few scheduling of interviews for named plaintiffs and that sort of thing, but KCC weren't as active as they would normally be in the general scheduling of cases. Really, a lot of the work was achieved and a lot of those 6,000 visas were handled by the embassies all by themselves, right? So they had a case, they contacted the people who had the interviews scheduled earlier in the year, and they ran with the interviews. They didn't need KCC to do anything really, apart from giving them the visa allocation at the end of that interview process. So it's a much different scenario to normal. Normal process would be that we would see around about 5,000 or 6,000 visas being issued on a fairly busy month. That would be about the most we've seen. So let's just take the number of visas that a normal processing month could go through with full capacity and all the embassies working, not being closed because of COVID, etc. That might be 6,000, perhaps 7,000 in a typical month. So you can see that if we only have 6 months of processing, and let's say 7,000 visas being issued a month with full speed, that would be 42,000 visas that could be processed within a 6-month period, and that's not enough, right? That's the math problem that I'm talking about. If, on the other hand, we had 9 months, and we had 9 times 7, that would be 63,000, or 9 times 6,000 visas, that would be 54,000. That would be enough. And so that's why I've been so concerned with the loss of, going down from 12 months down to 9 months. I wasn't worried. 9 months was still enough. From 9 months down to 6 months, I'm more worried about that. 6 months is not enough. And of course, it should be clear to some of you that there will be some countries that won't be processing cases at all, even if the judge tells them to, because they've got real COVID problems in those areas, and the embassies are not fully open. They're not going to be processing cases. So I doubt that we're even going to get 7,000 or 6,000 a month, because the full capacity of the system is not there. We also have concerns about KCC. The KCC have been fairly slow to respond recently. There seemed to be a whole month or 6 weeks or so where they almost just turned the phones off, and we're not responding to people, largely speaking. And so I think they actually reduced capacity, either deliberately or COVID perhaps possibly hit their teams. We don't know. Given those situations, anything that Charles Cook and team can do to give us some of that processing time back will be important. But if we only get into a scenario where we've got 6 months of processing, perhaps 7 months of processing, there will be an impact to the overall numbers that could be handled and processed through that system and through all of the embassies. And we would be, frankly, we'd be lucky to see 35 or 40,000 visas being issued during the full year at that point. So, that's a problem. Who will that be a problem for? Well, the way the DV lottery rules are written, the processing rules are written, KCC and the government are supposed to prioritize cases based on case number order. Within each region, they should be taking the lowest case numbers and processing them first. They have sometimes operated outside of that rule, but typically where things change. So, for example, in 2020, they had already gone current. They had announced being current, and then COVID happened. And so, at that point, they didn't retrogress the numbers. They didn't take the numbers down. They operated on a basis where any case number was current. And they continued that basis through September. But since they now know what's coming up, they should actually work on a lower case number order goes first, at least within the months. So at least it doesn't matter if they don't apply that order within the month. So at an embassy, for example, just as an example to explain the point, you may have 2 people at the same embassy, one with the case number of 10,000 and something, and the other one with the case number of 20,000 and something. If they're both at the embassy in the same month, it doesn't necessarily mean that the 10,000 number case has to be in front of the 20,000 case. Within the same month, it doesn't matter. The ordering, the prioritization of ordering only really matters for the overall progression of the visa bulletin and the general progression of how the cases are handled. So basically what I'm saying is that the biggest impact, if we were to have a shortened year, would fall on the highest case numbers in each region. That would be my assumption. It may not be 100% right. They may decide, look, this is a crazy year, we're just going to make everyone current. It's possible, but it's just not very likely. So we'll have to wait and see if that actually happens. The other thing that they're going to be wrestling with, as I touched on earlier, is that some embassies are not processing cases at all and probably won't be processing cases for some time because of COVID. And a judge may instruct the government to do all that they can, but the judge can't put people's lives at risk. And so if local conditions for a particular embassy determine that that embassy should stay closed, or if they're not able to operate in a safe way, no judge is going to tell them to do anything different, apart from perhaps planning ahead to do remote interviews and that sort of thing. That's the only thing I can imagine a judge might instruct them to do. So maybe that's possible, but again, it hasn't happened yet. So so we don't really know. We can't really predict how that's going to go. So okay, so I hope I've explained that generally, what's happened in terms of not having the 2 NLs, what's going to happen in terms of the lawsuit. That I'm very thankful that Charles Cook and team had the foresight to be filing this case early enough. They were concerned, and I think if any of you have followed Charles Cook and Siskin's videos, they've talked about, they assumed that Trump was going to extend the ban. They just operated on that basis, and he may do. But because the lawyers are very optimistic about what they can achieve, and they were very pessimistic, they took the pessimistic view of what Trump would do, which was a very smart thing they did, and it's the right way to operate, and so they were prepared for that, and they've bought us some time, frankly, by doing that. So I'm grateful for them for doing that. The lawsuit that they have filed, by the way, it was a paid-for lawsuit, but there was a class action aspect to it. So they are fighting for some named plaintiffs, but they're also saying, look, there's a principle of being fair, and so whilst these are the named plaintiffs, the same behaviour should happen for all other people affected by this behaviour of the government. And so, I'm hoping that we'll achieve a change of the mode of operation of the government and KCC and the embassies, etc., by that lawsuit. If not, we have to wait for the new president and the new administration and see what that can bring. But as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be, we're talking about February before Joe Biden can have any real effect on the processing or on the whole scenario. And February is when you would normally be seeing April interviews being arranged, so that would be quite impactful. Okay, so I think that's probably covered all the topics I wanted to cover for DV2021. I produced a video just a few days ago about DV2020, so I'm not going to discuss DV2020 any further. This video was just for DV2021, and hopefully that was helpful to you. Okay, everyone, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel, so that when I post these videos you get that information. Give this video a thumbs up if you like this sort of information. Please remember, I'm doing this for your benefit. If this information is important to you, then it will probably be important to others too. And so I'd like you to help me spread the word by liking my video, subscribing to my channel, and getting the information out there. As you all know, there are some other video channels that aren't quite as honest or accurate with their opinions, And so, let's get the right information out there and avoid some of the, the foolish comments that are made, about what will happen. There's a lot of bad information out there that's just not accurate. Okay, please do that for me. All right. Thanks everyone. Thanks for watching. Cheers now. Bye bye.